and get started. My name is Rebecca Jordan, and I am an assistant professor of reading education at Appalachian State University. I teach elementary and preschool, pre-service, and in-service teachers how to help their students develop language and literacy skills. I teach in face-to-face environments. I teach in 100% online environments, and I teach in hybrid environments as well. This is very much going to be an interactive discussion where you share what is working for you and what questions you have, and I'll share some of the things that work for me and that I have been struggling through to find solutions for. So I hope that sounds like a great plan to everybody, because I do want to hear your voices. If you would, when you go to speak, make sure you unmute yourself. I think everyone is muted to start with, but make sure you do unmute yourself when you're going to speak. Otherwise, we won't be able to hear you. So I wanted us to just start off with a little bit about who we are. What do you teach? How long have you been teaching online? Are you what kind of roles are you taking on? Just a general who we are. So if anyone is feeling brave enough to start that off and just share a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful to hear from you.
Hi, this is Steve Winnell.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, I'm from Eastern Kentucky University. I'm the director of our Instructional Design Center, but I've been teaching online for about 20 years.
Wow, you have a lot of great expertise to share with us, I'm sure.
Well, I don't know about that. I can share with you a lot of mistakes.
That's how we learn. So I see some people sharing in the chat box. I don't know if everyone has that pulled up where they can see it. So we have librarians, we have people who teach math, we have learning management system administrators, we've got people from 3 years to 23 years and in between. So there is a wealth of expertise in this room. Would anyone else? Like there are 17 of us here, so presuming that counting Kelly and myself out who already shared, there's about 15 others of you.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
So my name is Shivy Williams. I am an educational technology coordinator at Rowan Cabarrus Community College. And so I've taught online classes for the college. Actually, I taught 1 year. But I train instructors how to use Blackboard, and I work in the distance education department.
Wonderful.
So usually I have to at least teach one hybrid class a semester or a year.
Great. Well, I'm glad you're with us.
Thank you.
Hello there.
Hello.
My name is Vance. I'm a communication instructor at Alamance Community College in Graham, North Carolina. I taught, I think, some of the first online classes that NC State ever offered.
Wow.
Way back in the day. Now I teach a number of courses for Alamance. And for the last 3 or 4 years, I've taught public speaking online.
Great. So we have a lot of different roles represented in this room, which is wonderful, from frontline to back end support, both of which are critical. We who are doing the teaching couldn't do any of the teaching if it weren't for the people setting it all up and helping us get it all straight. I know that I am so grateful to Kelly this morning to help make sure all of this is running smoothly. Would anyone else like to share about themselves and what brings them here? All right, so it seems like we have all across the board lots of different experiences, lots of different fields. So I also wanted to, after we shared who we are, what are your current concerns around student engagement and what you're, I said currently offering, but it could be something that you've done in the past as well. So what are some of the concerns you have about it? Or issues you've run into? We talked about, we learned through the struggles. So what are the struggles we've faced that have forced us to learn? I know one of the things that I struggled with when I first started teaching online was actually getting students to meaningfully, I'm a big proponent and believer in collaborative learning, and I didn't feel as if that was occurring in my online classes when I first started teaching. It felt very much, it felt very didactic, it felt very much from me to each individual rather than them to each other and back and forth with me. And so that was a major concern that I had that helped prompted me to rethink some of the things I was doing, because I really wanted those arrows, those pathways to not just go from me to each particular student, but to go between among students and also back and forth with me.
Well, I can tell you one of my challenges has just been helping students to get comfortable and reasonably competent with the technology.
Yes.
Because for public speaking, they have to record their own speeches with their own equipment. That has its own set of challenges. And then trying to get them uploaded somewhere where I could view them and their fellow students could view them was really problematic. So just trying to teach people in the midst of trying to get them comfortable with technology, which many of them didn't know, has been a challenge for me.
Right, and not being there physically with them to help them get things set up as we might do in a traditional face-to-face class. That's absolutely a major concern, and I can't say that's something that I have any experience with, just because in education we don't have those sorts of challenges. But I'm sure that there are others here who can offer advice. But that does sound like a significant issue, absolutely, especially when you're dealing with perhaps students who aren't comfortable with any sort of technology to start with, and then you're throwing in all of the online technology, and then you're also adding this content piece of it as well. Some of the comments that I've seen in the chat box are simply participation in synchronous sessions, so ensuring that students show up to those is how I'm interpreting that, and also engage, not just sit back and expect to watch a lecture during a synchronous session. Please correct me if I'm misinterpreting that. Someone else also shared about keeping students actively learning the material for the course, but balancing that with not overwhelming them with too much work. And a similar struggle to what I mentioned at the beginning about having them engage with each other. And most of them, a few of them, absolutely, this is what Sarah shared, a few of them do it, and I have the same exact experience. Some of them thrive on that and seek it out, but by and large, most of them seem to want to just engage with the material and with the professor one-on-one, and ignore the fact that there are others in there learning together with them, or ideally learning together. We also have some, student, going back to just the technology and logistical side, having students to check their emails in Blackboard since they're not there physically, or we use at Appalachian, we use As You Learn. A lot of people I've heard mention Blackboard as well, and there may be other learning management systems out there that some of us are using as well. Just getting them to engage with it and find out the information that they need from us to be successful. Are there any, I think I am missing a few people that had chat box. I'm sorry, I wasn't scrolled down far enough. So a lot of people are mentioning about what my major struggle when I first started doing this, which is still an ongoing concern as well. I would not by any means say that I have 100% solved it, but that keeping students engaged with one another and through a cooperative learning in an asynchronous environment. I love the way Steve put it, an organic engagement with 3 arenas, faculty, each other, and content. Several of us are working on flipped learning as well, so helping students who may have never had flipped learning in their own education prior to coming to the college level, understanding what that is and how to engage with flipped instruction. For those of you who may not be familiar with flipped instruction, it's where they engage with the content and then they come to the course and they engage with one another and apply what they've learned independently, would be my super simple, oversimplified definition of flipped learning. If someone else would like to add to that, I would love for you to do that. Okay, so if no one else has anything to add on to what I've read from the comments and what we've heard from those of you who were willing to speak out loud, was that we really have concerns across the gamut. We have logistical concerns, we have technology concerns, we have engagement concerns as well. And when I say engagement, I mean with the students, with the professor, and with the content, engagement with all 3 of those. These are very valid and large issues that we need to work through. So I would then ask you, if these are our concerns collectively across these large areas, how do you currently work to engage students in your courses? What are some of the things that we're currently doing to engage students in 100% online courses? And I would love, I don't mind sharing out from the chat box, but I would love if you're willing to speak out. That would be phenomenal, because I don't trust myself to say what you mean. So I would love it if you are willing to share out, but if not, I'm happy to read from the chat box too.
This is Kelly from Davidson Community College.
Hi, Kelly.
I teach math, and I have students work in groups on lab assignments. So they're longer assignments in which students have to not just do math, but think critically about the math and context. And I use Google Docs to help facilitate the asynchronous communication, so they can, work in the documents and then leave comments for others who have already worked in the document. I also ask them to write using different colored fonts. I think that kind of helps them keep track of who's been saying what. Absolutely. Comments for each other, it's nice because it emails out, so then students don't have to keep coming back and checking the documents. So they'll get an email if one of their group members have been making comments.
That is great. How do you find that are students enjoying this process? Do they feel as if they're learning from it? I love it. That sounds phenomenal.
Well, it takes a little bit of getting used to. So in the beginning, it can be a little bit rough and until they find their groove. But by the end, I usually get a lot of positive feedback that it's generally worked well. I also have to move some groups around to help kind of, match styles better. The biggest complaint I get from students is timing. So the students that like to work ahead are, complain that some students wait until the last minute. And then the students who wait until the last minute are upset because some students have already done the entire lab. And then it looks like they're just copying. So moving around to facilitate when students like to work is kind of my biggest challenge in the course.
That's really a fascinating way that you happen to do that. And you read my mind, because my question was going to be, How do you deal with, are they allowed to self-select groups, or do you assign? But then you answered it with saying, you know, sometimes we have to make changes. And I think that's something that's hard for, I know it was hard for me, I won't speak for others, to be okay with, is the fact that, okay, what I'd originally planned isn't working and I need to change things midstream, and being okay with that was difficult for me. But it's very, very important, especially when we're, you know, in all types of learning environments, but I think especially when we're in a 100% online environment, because otherwise it's just not doing anyone any good, and we don't have that face-to-face dialogue, perhaps those nonverbal cues, unless we're in a synchronous session, to let us know that, you know, something isn't working right, I need to change something. That's phenomenal. Anyone else have anything to share about how they currently engage students in their courses? I know there's so many phenomenal ideas out there.
I need to hold the mic, but can I share one more thing?
Please.
I also use Google Hangouts a lot with students, and once I show them how to use it, I think they're using it with each other a lot, which is nice because not only do they have the you know, the immediate feedback from each other, but when they have their webcams on, I think it makes it like more intimate. Intimate might not be the right word, but because they're actually seeing each other, and I don't have a webcam on right now, so I'm not role modeling that very well, but when they see each other, I think it makes more of a connection, like it personalizes it, so they feel more connected to each other. And then once they've made that connection and they kind of solidify that group, then I think they are each other's cheerleaders, and they make, you know, a lot of positive comments. So it's not just where they did it wrong. You know, they'll make comments like, "Hey, that was a nice way that you worded that," and I think that's really positive feedback that they, you know, for them have learned to do that.
Absolutely, I would agree that having them engage in small group discussion in a similar way to what you might find in a face-to-face class, having them do that through a video technology system. You mentioned Google Hangouts. At Appalachian, we have Zoom, so I use Zoom for them as well. And it really creates cross-student connections in a way that simply responding to someone's written words does not do. So that has been absolutely huge for me, and helping student VoiceThread is another great way for students to be able to do that as well. VoiceThread is something that we just actually adopted here at Appalachian, and so I'm still learning it. So please correct me if I'm wrong on this. Can you do live, like, VoiceThread group meetings, or are they all asynchronous when you use VoiceThread? I myself am not sure of the answer to that. One of the benefits of it I'm reading is that it's mobile friendly, which is great for students who are on the go and able to easily use it. And we all know our students' lives are slammed full of a million responsibilities that they're trying to balance with their schoolwork as well. So mobile friendly is a huge plus. I would be interested to find out if VoiceThread could do synchronous group meetings, because that's one of the things that I've loved about Google Hangouts and about Zoom, is the ability to engage in real-time discussion with one another. I love discussion boards, don't get me wrong, but the lack of immediate response back and forth with one another, it creates more of a stilted conversation. Whereas if you're right there in the video with one another, I can ask a question or I can respond immediately. And then even if I tell students you need to respond back to the student who's asking you a question, that doesn't always happen in a discussion board, even when it sends out an email, and I would say probably more often than not, I notice in a discussion board, I don't notice that same authentic depth of discussion as I see in a synchronous group chat, where they're given a similar prompt to what we may have traditionally done in a discussion board. Has anyone had a similar experience? We were just hearing about the one in Google Hangout, which was what made me think about it. Would anyone else have a similar or a, you say that, but here's something that happened with me when I was using synchronous video discussions that they would like to bring up as a problem that they've encountered with using that means of engagement?
Well, I know we have instructors that grade on the discussion, and they force their students to reply to a certain number of other students.
Absolutely. How do you feel that works in terms of? I guess I won't put it even in terms of how do you feel that works. How have you seen that working for students and for teachers?
I'm an LMS admin, but since the instructors or some of these instructors do it have done it over several years, I figure it must be working.
So my experience with that, which is just my experience with it, take it for what it's worth, because I actually, and I say this and I do use this for when I have them do a discussion board. There are a couple of different ways I've found that you can grade those. You can grade those based on, I am requiring you to respond, to post this many times, initially your reaction to this question, idea, whatever it might be. And I am also expecting you to respond to a certain number of your peers. And in some of the learning management systems, I'm not sure if they all have this capability. It can actually automatically, if you're doing it simply based on quantity, it can actually grade that for you, which is nice as the instructor, and it makes life easy, and it's easy to go to that. But I don't know that we're getting full engagement from students and across students when they are doing that. Sometimes they're not substantive responses. Sometimes they are things like, that's really neat, or I really appreciate you sharing that, or great idea. So what I did when I started noticing that was I started requiring them to be what I called substantive responses. And I gave examples and non-examples of what are substantive responses, providing an example by elaborating on what they've said, asking a question, respectfully disagreeing. And I also gave non-examples of things that are not substantive responses. Some of those comments that I just said, such as, great idea, I really like that, good job, those sort of responses. So that made life more difficult on me as the instructor, because now I can't just simply use the learning management system to do a checkoff and say, yep, they posted, and yes, they replied to this many, because I need to actually be reading them, which we should be doing as instructors 100% of the time, I firmly believe, and seeing what are they saying, so that way I can determine, are they actually engaging with the content and with each other, and also so that way I can engage back to them and can correct any misunderstandings that I might notice in there, and can also encourage and push forward when it is an in-depth, thoughtful response. Push them to go even further with that when you see that emerging idea there. But my concerns still remained, so we've moved kind of a step higher. My concerns still remained that while they were substantive responses and they were sharing ideas, it was not necessarily an authentic discussion. It was simply, I know I have to post my response to this, and it may have been a thoughtful, in-depth response to the question or topic, and I know I need to reply to this many of my classmates, and they may have been substantive responses, but the conversation ended right there. Very, very few students, and there were some, absolutely, but I would say the minority, would actually go back and respond deeply to the person who did pose a question to them, or who did respectfully disagree, or who did provide another example of what they are talking about. Whereas in a real-time live conversation, it was a dialogue. So for me, that was that was the push, and it does make grading a lot harder because now I have to, reading through a list of posts is much easier than listening to a conversation. And you can't have a whole class in a conversation. And I would always have them do it where they got to pick their own time and they would record their session so that way I could then watch it later. So much more time consuming. And you kind of are weeding through some of the responses to get to those authentic dialogues. But I do think that it has been very impactful in my students' engagement with the content and with each other. And with each other to impact their engagement with the content because they forced each other to think deeply about the content in a way that peers can do that is sometimes a lot more difficult for us to do top down. I'm reading this. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I would see that you'd probably want to create activities or discussions that are very non-threatening at the start because you're and force them to participate, to learn the technology, and when they become, and not so much for grades in, but just for them to become comfortable with the technology, and then when somebody makes a comment later on, then they don't have to worry about, oh, how do I use this tool? They just jump in and start making, substantive responses.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. And I would say also the way our systems each do online courses and cohorts and whatnot, this may or may not be an issue for you, but not only, as you're saying, are they getting comfortable with the technology, which we know is a major hurdle to get over. They're also getting comfortable with each other in a non-threatening question. So I don't need to put myself out there to this, major theoretical response, and I'm not really sure how this is, if I'm right or if I'm wrong, or how this is, if there is no right or wrong, how this is going to be interpreted by the people in my group. Are they going to judge me? We're all always worried if someone is going to judge us. So it enables them both to get comfortable with the technology and with each other and develop those authentic relationships, even though we're not in the same physical space. I absolutely agree with you. That's a critical component.
Now, we're not using the video, under participants this time, but in an earlier session, I was, and I don't use Zoom a whole lot, but I've been really impressed. Like in an earlier presentation, you had, 30 participants. Not all had video. Some had still images, but the ones that did have video had quality video, and that's your talking head. But then you had, I didn't see a hiccup with Zoom because here's a presentation, and I think that was maybe a Prezi presentation, and I'm watching talking heads, and then you can begin to see what these other people look like. I mean, Zoom is a nice little tool.
Yes, it is wonderful. I have no complaints with it at all. I'm really glad that our system adopted it, and I would recommend it to. And I'm not in the learning technology support world, but I would definitely, as a user and someone who helps students to use it, I would absolutely recommend it. It is wonderful. Sarah also shared that she teaches math, and she shared that she has students post how they work through a problem, and they don't necessarily, correct me if I'm misinterpreting, Sarah, they don't necessarily have to respond to each other. However, if I am not sure how I worked a problem, I can go and look and see that Joe worked it this way, and I can ask him a question to say, hey, as a peer-to-peer support learning model, why did you do it like that? I see that you got what was the right answer, and I didn't, and I see how you worked it, but I'm not quite sure why you did this step right here. Am I representing that accurately, Sarah? Okay, great. She says that that's right. I love that because that, I mean, there's so much research out there that shows us that students really learn from one another. And that's the part where I think sometimes in 100% online courses where we fall down because we're missing out on that student to student learning as well. So that's a great way to use discussion board posts in a really meaningful way.
Have you ever used WordPress? I would think if you're spread across the country or the world, you could get a free WordPress site as a study group, and you could all begin to share on that, and you can actually publish remotely. You know, in fact, I've done that several times years ago. Was how do I take this phone out and record something and push it up to WordPress and not have to come back to the office to do it?
I don't have much experience with WordPress myself, but with all of the people in the room, I'm sure someone has something they could share in regards to that. That sounds like a great idea.
Well, see, I've seen with that, one thing they could do, and I don't know whether you want as an instructor to allow them, they can take pictures of the notes on the board. They can take pictures of the handouts you give them, and once those are digitized, well, I guess only one person has to come to class every day, and then everybody else can stay at home and sleep.
Yeah, in that way they're getting the content, and if that could be an accommodation for somebody who is physically unable to attend a class, a traditional face-to-face class as well. So I noticed that, and Colleen was asking Sarah, and I just want to make sure if any of you don't have your chat boxes open that you're not missing this conversation, because it's really, I think this is where we learn from one another, was that Colleen asked, and I hope it's okay that I'm sharing this, Colleen, if there was anything to make sure that students actually read each other's posts rather than simply posting their own solution to the problem and then saying, okay, well, I've done that, I'm done now. And Sarah shared that they each have to post a unique problem, so they're not able to replicate one another. So they must at least know what problems have already been worked when they are posting. Well, I'm not a math instructor at all. In fact, I would say that math is one of my, I probably need you to help me, Sarah, with my math. But I love that then when I get to a test at the end, I can go back and see how these various problems have been worked. And there's almost some, I would presume, some natural, even though you're not requiring them to respond to anybody or ask any questions, there's a lot of natural engagement that occurs because I might see a problem similar to that on the test, and I need to understand why you worked it the way you did. Is that a fair presumption? Yes, she says yes, they use it to help study and also to communicate with each other. And I can't emphasize enough how much I believe that communication with each other is really the key to student engagement within our courses. If they're not engaging with each other, I question how deeply they're engaging with the content itself. So that's huge. That's great to know. Are there other ideas that you'd be willing to share with us on ways that you currently engage students with your courses?
Well, I don't know how useful it would be for everybody, but I can throw this out.
That'd be wonderful.
I teach public speaking online, which, as I say, can be problematic. It requires the student to record their own speech in front of an audience of at least 4 adults. And I could go into how many problems that has caused. But each student is assigned 3 speakers for each round of speeches. and they are required to do a critical analysis of that speaker. I have to explain critical doesn't mean nasty, and it doesn't always mean negative. If they're doing something well, you ought to tell them that too. So I grade them on the quality of their feedback for that speaker, and then each speaker is provided a copy of that feedback with the reviewer's name removed. So they actually get honest feedback on their speeches from their fellow students. And what I find is that students start to share feedback with each other that I don't even require in the course.
That's wonderful. That's really, what I like about that is that you're getting even though the names are removed, what that allows for, as you pointed out so beautifully, is for students to really be honest, to really put themselves out there, and they don't have to worry about what that someone's not going to like them now that they've said X about their speech. That they're really allowed to be honest, and also to receive that feedback in a way that is or perhaps less threatening than if it were face to face, or if it were done even with names on there.
Exactly. Now, of course, if somebody makes a comment that's out of bounds, I remove that before I share it with the speaker.
Okay. That's great. That's great that they're learning how to dialogue with one another in a professional setting as well, to provide that sort of feedback, both, as you put it, that critical feedback, which doesn't, so often students assume that means negative, but just pushing each other, pushing ourselves forward. Do they ever get to debrief with one another about that?
I don't require that really. Sometimes it may happen informally if they choose to do it on their own, but I don't require that for the course.
Okay. That is really, I love that idea. That's a great way to have them engage with one another around something that is so people oriented, even in an 100% online environment. That's great. Would anyone else? Yes.
I came across a recording tool maybe a month ago, maybe a little more, called Periscope, and it installed on my phone fairly easy. Now, there may be security issues, I don't know, and there may be a better product, but what was nice about it is I installed it and I started walking around, and I was recording video and my audio as I'm discussing something. With the phone, I could have flipped it so that it was facing me, and it was actually streaming live, but it was also recording it at the same time. And I could see where, if you have students that are at a distance, they could actually use something like that, and the others in the group that are supposed to critique could actually be listening to it live.
That's a great app. I'm not familiar with that myself. I'll have to check that out. And you said Periscope, like what comes out of a submarine? That kind of.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's great.
And it was actually, I came across it because there was was the ISTE conference. It's whenever the ISTE conference was, maybe a month or two ago, and they were talking about, for people that aren't going to be at the conference, we're going to have some people walking around recording. And it ended up that the audio wasn't great because if somebody's speaking on a stage and you're using your phone, you're probably not getting good audio, but you are getting good video. And so that got me to play with it, and I went, well, gosh, I didn't have to read anything to figure out how to install it on my Android phone, and I started walking around recording or walking around talking. And what surprised me was I didn't have to do anything extra. It had actually, when I stopped the streaming, it said, hey, here's a link to your recording. And so not only could they have listened to it live, they could also go back immediately and listen to the recorded version.
Well, that's great. There's lots of applications for that. I'll definitely have to check out with Kelly and Emery about that. Thank you for sharing that. That's a great engagement tool. And we could even ask students for them if depending on what our content is, I could imagine various contents where they need to upload a video of perhaps themselves engaging in an activity or a task to Periscope, or video themselves with Periscope and then upload it to the LMS, or to be able to engage in dialogue about how this particular activity was completed, similar to what Sarah was sharing about working through the math problem, but perhaps if it were something where it couldn't be uploaded in the same way, it needed to be visually seen, even though we're in separate environments.
Yeah.
I don't want to cut anyone off about anything else you would like to share about what you're currently doing with engagement, because I think I personally I'm learning so much from everything that you're sharing on the things that you are doing to engage your students in the classes. I hope you all are as well, so I don't want to cut anyone else off on this important central topic. And Bill posted in the chat Periscope in case anybody was wondering about how to look that up. Thank you, Bill. So the other part that we've already touched on, in fact, I don't know that we need to spend a lot of time here because it came up naturally, is the role that group work plays in student engagement in a 100% online course. I am a firm believer, as I've mentioned, that in most contents, perhaps, I try to avoid absolutes, but in most contents, that it is very difficult to engage deeply with the content if I'm not also engaging with fellow learners as well, and seeing the struggles they're moving through, helping them through those, and them helping me through it as well. I'm a big believer in social learning, so there's a connection there between why I think these are so integral. Does anyone else have anything they want to ask or share about group work? We've already talked a lot here, but if you have anything to add, I don't want to cut you off because I do think that it is critical. Maybe you're thinking, in my content, I'm not sure how I could get my students to engage in group work in a meaningful way. If so, please be brave enough to share that with us, because this is a no judgment zone. This is Planet Fitness, judgment-free zone, and we're here to learn together. While you think, I do want to share, in case you don't have the chat box open, that Sybil shared with us about video collaboratory that let students collaborate around video materials, either things they've uploaded or created materials from somewhere else, such as YouTube or Vimeo. So again, I have no familiarity with video collaboratory, so I'm really excited to check that out moving forward. That's excellent. Thank you, Sybil.
And I see that Sybil's on that team because I'm on their site now.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So Sybil,
Yes, I am.
we'll come to you and say, please help us.
Right, and there, I did a presentation in the previous session on video collaboratory, so that PowerPoint will be up, and it has a lot of information as well. So hope everybody will check that out, because it is a great tool for giving detailed commentary to students, or I sometimes use it so that I pose questions to them, and getting them engaged is pretty easy, because I just say you need to go in and answer have some comment about each of my questions. And then it has a comment thread, so then they start a discussion usually with each other.
That's wonderful. I'm looking forward to experimenting with that. Thank you very much.
Great.
So if no one else had anything else to add about group work, although of course we can come back to it. This is not a wedding. You do not have to speak now or forever hold your peace. But what about differentiation? For me, I find that differentiation is very difficult in a 100% online environment because of the lack of, by and large, the lack of nonverbal cues, that unless I have some sort of accommodation plan for my student and I know I need to provide a particular accommodation or modification, I find it much more difficult to differentiate for my students. However, similar to my beliefs about the necessity of student-to-student learning in terms of engagement and really in terms of eventually, because the goal of engagement is learning the content, in terms of eventually really deeply learning that content, I believe that differentiation is crucial. I'm not going to engage deeply if it is too quote unquote easy or too quote unquote hard. It has to be just right for me as the individual learner, for me to really engage with the content and then because of that, learn that material. What are some of the things that you do to differentiate for your students? Or let me actually ask a different question to start. Are there any means you have in place to determine needs at the beginning of the course so that way you can plan for some students already have a deeper knowledge base or a higher comfort level than other students? One of the things that I do at the beginning of my courses, and again, I teach future and current teachers how to teach children to read. We simply start off with a reflection about who we are as readers, and they're asked several different questions about their experiences with reading, how they consider themselves as a reader, and typically people outside of the reading field find this surprising, but a lot of times you have both extremes as future and current teachers. You have people who say, I hated to read. It was a miserable experience for me in school. And you, of course, have the side that I think is more commonly expected, although is actually pretty equally prevalent to the opposite side, to say, I loved reading. I always knew I wanted to be a teacher. I went home and played school and practiced, pretended to teach my stuffed animals to read. You've got both of those extremes of people saying, I still don't like to read. I still don't consider myself a reader. And people who feel the opposite way as well. So one of the first things I do to understand where they're coming from is simply to ask them some reflective questions on who they are as a reader and as a student. And that's something that works for my particular content area. I can see that working similarly, perhaps for Sarah and math. What is your comfort with math? And you probably know some of the courses they've already taken in math to get to this point. But what is your comfort level with it? What is your enjoyment with it? I could see the same thing working for public speaking as well. How confident do you feel speaking in front of groups, and how do the various group demographics affect that comfort? So I might be very comfortable speaking in front of a group of 6-year-olds. As a teacher, I could say that's where my comfort is great. As 6-year-olds, I can kill that any day of the week. But you ask me to speak in front of a group of peers, my confidence is going to drop dramatically for me personally with that public speaking component.
Well, since you brought up my area, I would say a lot of your comfort level has to do with the amount of control you have in a situation.
It's true.
I too I'm comfortable in front of a class, in front of a group of my peers. Well, not so good necessarily. Of course, I'm basically an introvert, so that's got a little bit to do with it. Believe it or not, I'm an introvert and I teach public speaking. How ironic is that? What I do early in my course is I have a couple of practice speeches that they do, which gets them used to the idea of recording, as well as we see what kind of technical problems everybody's having, and maybe work on ways to work them out. I do a fairly serious speech, something like, describe to us what would be your idea of a perfect day. And then I'll pick kind of a goofy topic, like come up with a legend that explains why pelicans have large beaks.
That's great.
Well, the idea is to get them in a little more creative mode. I know, being educators, we all have critical thinking that we emphasize, and we shove it down the throats of our students until they gag on it properly. But we don't talk a whole lot, I don't think, about actual creative thinking, which you can't really do if you're in a critical thinking mode. So I want to see where they are in terms of comfort level with public speaking, and where they are creatively.
Mm-hmm.
Are there just atrophied creative muscles up there, or are they the folks that think, oh, well, I am much too smart and sophisticated to do silly stuff like this? Or is there something else going on? So a couple of low stakes, ungraded practice speeches can actually help me with that. The difference is it's time consuming for me, but teaching public speaking is time consuming anyway.
Right. I really believe it's important for us to differentiate for our students in an online environment just as we would in a face-to-face environment. I can't say that I see it occurring as frequently as I do face-to-face, and I also can't, and this is just my experience, your mileage may vary, I also can't say that I see it even occurring in face-to-face in higher education as often as it probably should. I think sometimes in both online and face-to-face, we get so caught up in the need for everything to be absolutely equal, and I have to grade this, and I have to grade all of these various components, and they each need this, and it wouldn't be fair for me to make an exception for this student over that student. And sometimes it is not. Sometimes when they've missed a deadline, they've missed a deadline. Absolutely. I'm not saying that we should just be giving free passes out everywhere. But how can I set them up and scaffold my instruction for particular students in a way that allows them each to meet that same goal? It requires much, much, much more of us as the instructor on the front end, because I can't simply set my course up and then let them run through it at their own pace, although that is one means of differentiation. But what about for the student who is simply not understanding this principle of the content you're teaching? How am I going to stop the course for this student without stopping it for the others and remediate, or on the other hand, push forward because this individual already gets this. What else can I teach them? And change course midstream on an individual or perhaps on a small group level. It's the part of online teaching that nobody realizes that we're doing. It's why I think the perception from the outside world is, oh, it's online. You're learning online. You're teaching online. Well, as we all know, there are so many extra things we have to do to provide students with this ideal learning environment when we're not in the same physical space that do make our jobs so much more difficult, but are so worth it for our students. And I don't know that there's any one particular answer across contents and across students, but I would encourage you to think about in your content and with your students, what are perhaps some, for lack of a better word, checkpoints that I could put into place and various supports at different levels that I could give to students who are exceeding the expectation at this point in the course and need more. What can I put in place for students who are struggling with the content? And I'm concerned at this particular checkpoint that they are not on track to meet that goal that I have for all of my students at the end of the course. How can I support them and help them to make whatever connections they seem to be missing? We're getting close to the end of our time together, but the best thing that I can say in terms of a differentiation and engagement is that each student needs to be thought of individually, which again, I know makes our lives so much more difficult, but I think you will really see a difference in the learning of your students, and on a more something else, I don't know what the word I'm looking here for is, arena, I think you'll see enhanced teaching evaluations if that's something that's important to you. When the students really feel as if for him or for her, you really thought about his or her needs and provided that consistent and meaningful interaction with each student. Again, thinking of the diagram with the arrows going not just from us to the students, to each student, but also back and forth from the students to us and across students to one another. Bill also just posted an excellent book by Luis Alvarado, Imagine All the People, Being Culturally Responsive with Online Students. It's a great resource. I highly recommend it. Thank you for sharing that, Bill. And then Janice posed a question that asked, well, how can you tell the difference between a student who is struggling because they are just not doing the work versus a student who may have learning issues that slow them down? And that is a concern. I have some ideas there, but I don't know that if 100% of the time you're going to be able to tell the difference. But I will provide some thoughts about that as well. And then Bill also shared, before I respond to Janice, about an earlier presentation that has been recorded, which you can check out, about teaching to culturally diverse students. So thank you for that recommendation.
Well, and that was, it wasn't a book, it was his presentation title.
Oh, okay.
And so, yeah, he's like you.
That's great. For some reason, I was thinking that I think there is a book with a very similar name to that.
Oh, okay.
But I may be imagining it. But that's great. So that's great to look up. So my recommendation, Janice, is first to look at their responses. So sometimes a student doesn't do the work because they are struggling. And at that point, it is very difficult to know what the difference is. Are you simply not doing the work, or are you not doing the work because you feel defeated? So what I do then, what's worked for me, and it's not a perfect 100% of the time accurate solution, but what's worked for me and some of my students in this is to make sure that I am constantly checking in with my students, especially those who I notice who are lagging in their work, who are not posting, who are not engaging with the content and with their classmates and with me in a one-on-one manner. So, and again, not necessarily the same physical space, but saying, okay, I'm requiring you to meet with me via Zoom, or I'm sending you this email, or I'm doing something to reach out to you and ask you, hey, what's going on? I've noticed this. Can you tell me what's going on? How can I help you? And I usually start with the least intimidating method, which is just a quick email to say, hey, missed your response last night. Everything okay? Can't wait to hear from you. And 9 times out of 10, they'll respond and say, oh my goodness, there was a family emergency, there was this, there was that. And usually, by catching it early on in the semester, it usually works itself out. It's like, oh wow, she's really watching me. Okay, I can't just slide by. That is not a 100% foolproof solution though. There are students who will not respond, and then we up to the next level to say, okay, I'm gonna come back in again, and eventually I'm gonna say, I'm requiring you at this point that we need to have a one-on-one via Zoom or Google Hangout or whatever your learning management system has, a way for us to engage via dialogue together about what's going on with you. And then they may, a lot of times in that, if it's not something that was just a one-time thing, say, you know, I'm really feeling like I don't understand this. I'm feeling overwhelmed. They usually will say I'm feeling overwhelmed rather than I'm feeling like I don't understand. I think it's a defensive mechanism. And that can help me to start to piece through the clues to figure out that difference between I'm just not engaged because I'm choosing not to be, versus I'm not engaging because I feel overwhelmed by the content and it's too difficult for me right now. I need some scaffolding in place. That's where I would recommend starting with that. But again, it requires a lot more from us, and you will still have students, unfortunately, who just simply choose not to do the work. I like to believe that it's not the majority. I like to believe that most of our students really want to be there and want to learn, but I'm by nature an optimist, so keep that in your mind. It is officially 12:01, so I just want to thank you each for your time, for sharing your experiences. I've learned a lot from each of you. If you have any other questions or concerns or want to chat individually, I'm going to stay on for a few minutes. But I just want to thank you for sharing who you are and what you do.